Imagine waking up one morning, walking down to your dock, the dock you built, maintained, and paid for, only to find strangers throwing a party on it. Balloons, champagne, loud music, and in the middle of it all, your HOA president claiming your private property now belongs to the community. That's exactly what happened to David Mercer, a retired marine engineer who just wanted peace after losing his wife. But what the HOA didn't know was that David wasn't just another homeowner. He was their silent landlord. And when they pushed him too far, he didn't yell. He didn't argue. He rewrote the rules beneath their feet. When David Mercer moved into the small coastal community of Havens Reach, he wasn't looking for excitement. He was searching for quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't just the absence of noise, but the presence of peace. After 40 years as a marine engineer, designing harbors, building seawalls, and studying the patterns of tides, he wanted nothing more than to wake up, make black coffee, and watch the sunrise burn across the water from his private dock. The dock wasn't large or luxurious. It was simple. Oak planks, brass fittings polished by salt air, and a small mooring post he had carved himself decades ago. But it was his sanctuary. His late wife, Caroline, had loved it there. She'd sit beside him in the evenings, her hand resting on his, saying that the sound of the waves reminded her that peace was something you built, not something you waited for. After she passed, David thought he'd never feel that kind of stillness again. The world had a way of moving on when your heart didn't want to. But the dock anchored him, literally and emotionally. Every morning, he'd take his small fishing boat out just past the cove, throw a line, and let the ocean breathe for him. Neighbors came and went, friendly waves and polite small talk, but David stayed mostly to himself. He had the soft patience of someone who'd already fought the hardest battles life could throw at him. On the surface, he was a quiet retiree enjoying his twilight years by the water. But under that calm, there was a depth most people didn't see. You could tell by the way he looked at the coastline that he understood it differently. When storms hit, he didn't panic like the others. He'd measure the strength of the waves with his eyes, calculating, knowing exactly which direction the current would pull next. The truth was, Havens Reach existed because of him. Long before the HOA, long before the pastel-painted homes and manicured lawns, David had been one of the engineers who mapped the entire bay. He had helped dredge the inlet, designed the retaining walls, and advised on how to preserve the marshes that framed the community. It was ironic, really. The neighbors thought of him as just another old man with a boat. None of them realized they were living on foundations he'd built with his own hands. But David didn't correct them. He didn't need to. There was a kind of quiet power in being underestimated. It allowed him to observe, to listen, to notice how easily people confused ownership with control. He understood that human nature hadn't changed much since his early engineering days. People always wanted to expand, to dominate, to stamp their authority on something that was already working fine. That's why he kept to himself. He'd already learned that some battles are lost the moment you let pride steer the ship. Most evenings, he'd sit on the edge of the dock as the light faded, tracing the grain of the wood beneath his fingertips, remembering how Caroline used to say, "Every beam has a story, every tide a purpose." The dock wasn't just timber and bolts, it was a timeline. It had witnessed their anniversaries, their quiet arguments, their laughter echoing over the water. It held every chapter of his marriage. So when he looked out across the still surface of the bay, he wasn't just seeing the sea, he was seeing her reflection in it. That's what made it sacred. Not legally, but spiritually. Sometimes he wondered what newcomers thought when they saw his dock standing a few feet apart from the others, marked with a small brass plaque that simply read, Mercer. Maybe they assumed it was decorative, or perhaps they envied the exclusivity of it. Either way, David didn't mind. Let them guess. The dock didn't need to prove its worth to anyone, and neither did he. But beneath that peace was a quiet awareness. a sense that the stillness he had built could be fragile. That in a world full of people eager to claim and control, solitude was its own kind of rebellion. There was something deeply human about that realization. We build things to last, homes, marriages, reputations, but time and ego have a way of testing what's truly ours. David had seen it happen 100 times over in his career. Developers rewriting contracts, bureaucrats changing covenants, communities turning on their own. It always started small, with one person deciding they knew better than everyone else. The kind who confused authority with wisdom. The kind who would look at something beautiful and decide it needed a rule book. He didn't know it yet, but that pattern was about to repeat itself. This time, in his own backyard. As the last streaks of sun faded over the bay and the dock lights flickered on, David leaned back in his chair and listened to the hush of the water. Somewhere deep inside, a small unease stirred, like the ocean inhaling before a storm. He brushed it off, believing peace was permanent here, that this place was untouchable. But even the calmest waters hide their own currents, waiting for the moment to rise. It started with a letter, a neatly folded piece of paper slipped into David Mercer's mailbox, stamped with the HOA logo and signed in looping cursive by someone he'd barely heard of, Karen Dunlop, the newly elected president. The tone was polite, but the words carried weight. According to the revised community guidelines, all docks along the bay were now classified as shared recreational spaces. Every homeowner, it said, was expected to comply with new regulations to promote unity and fairness. David read it twice, slowly, as if the meaning might change the second time. But it didn't. In black and white, his private dock, his sanctuary, was no longer his. It had become, at least in her mind, community property. He sat at the kitchen table with the letter in hand, the same table where Caroline used to sort through bills and postcards. For a moment he thought it was a mistake. Bureaucracies make those all the time. Maybe the wording was unclear. Maybe the rule didn't apply to him. He decided he'd clarify it politely at the next meeting. That was his first instinct, to assume reason still worked. But reason, as he would soon learn, was the first casualty when people like Karen gained power. Karen Dunlop was a name whispered around the neighborhood long before that letter. She'd moved in less than a year ago and wasted no time running for the HOA board. People described her as organized, detail-oriented, a go-getter, the kind of coded language neighbors used when they were too polite to say controlling. She was the type who noticed the shade of your curtains and asked if they complied with community guidelines. The kind who smiled with her teeth but never with her eyes. For Karen, rules weren't about harmony. They were about hierarchy. She needed people to follow because that's how she felt important. A week after the letter, David stepped out one morning to find a crew of young men unloading paint buckets at the edge of his property. They were wearing HOA maintenance vests and chatting casually, setting up ladders by his gate. He approached them calmly, assuming there'd been a mix-up. But then he saw the sign, bright blue, bolted directly into the post at the head of his dock. Community dock, access hours 9 a.m., 7 p.m. Beneath it, in small print, Havens Reach HOA property. His pulse slowed, not from fear, but from disbelief. His nameplate, the small brass plaque that read Mercer, had been unscrewed and left on the ground. He asked the foreman who authorized the work. The man shrugged and pointed up the hill, where Karen stood on the walkway in her crisp white blazer, clipboard in hand. Her hair was pinned tight, her sunglasses mirrored. She waved cheerfully, as if she'd done him a favor. When he reached her, she greeted him like a stranger at a hotel lobby. "Mr. Mercer, isn't it wonderful? We're standardizing the look of all waterfront properties. It'll increase our property value and promote inclusion. You'll thank me later." He wanted to laugh, but the absurdity of it tightened in his chest instead. "That's my dock," he said simply. Private property. It's deeded separately. Karen tilted her head, the way people do when they're pretending to listen. Oh, I'm aware of the previous classifications, she replied, drawing invisible quotation marks in the air. But the board voted to update the covenants. All waterfront access is now communal. It's about equity, Mr. Mercer. You understand. Her tone carried the gentle condescension of someone talking to a child. Equity. The word stung in a way it wasn't meant to. It was the kind of word people like Karen wielded when they wanted to make selfishness sound noble. She walked away mid-conversation, barking new orders at the workers, and David just stood there, feeling the quiet around him shift into something foreign. For the first time, his sanctuary didn't feel safe. It felt invaded. Over the next few days, neighbors started whispering. Some sympathized, but most avoided involvement. People like Karen had a talent for making others fearful of friction. They'd rather keep their lawns perfect and their heads down than question authority. And that's how control spreads, through silence, not force. David understood that. He'd seen it in boardrooms, in shipyards, in every place where power became a substitute for purpose. But knowing didn't make it easier to watch. The maintenance crew came back twice more that week, repainting the railing and adding matching white fencing to align with the community aesthetic. Karen supervised every brush stroke, sitter-fitik, yurdi-kartit, making comments about consistency. When David mentioned the damage to his wood grain, she smiled thinly. That's the price of progress, she said, walking off before he could respond. Each day, the dock looked less like his and more like a museum exhibit curated by someone else. The small imperfections Caroline loved, the uneven varnish on the north side, the slight tilt in the mooring post, were erased in the name of order. And with each change, something inside him hardened. It wasn't just about property anymore. It was about identity. When someone takes what you built, they're not just stealing objects, they're rewriting your story. Karen's control grew bolder. She began hosting HOA inspections, walking along the docks with her clipboard, pointing out supposed violations. One afternoon, David overheard her telling a neighbor that private ownership was an outdated concept. That's when it hit him. She didn't misunderstand the law. She was betting that no one would challenge her interpretation of it. She thrived on compliance, on the quiet surrender of those too weary to resist. David didn't argue. He watched, because that's what people underestimate about the quiet ones. They're not passive, they're patient. He began collecting everything, photos of the changes, copies of her letters, notes from neighbors too afraid to speak up. The more Karen acted with authority, the more she revealed her ignorance of who she was actually dealing with. And beneath the surface of his calm, something shifted. The same precision that once built seawalls began to map out her downfall. He didn't show it, not yet, because timing, like the tide, is everything. And he knew, sooner or later, every storm meets the shore. It didn't take long for Karen's new community initiative to turn into something far beyond policy. Within a few weeks, David's dock had become the HOA's favorite gathering spot. What had once been his quiet refuge was now a stage for weekend yoga sessions, wine tastings, and so-called exclusive HOA picnics that filled the air with chatter, laughter, and the thump of portable speakers. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent decades engineering coastlines designed to withstand pressure, and now the pressure was personal, relentless, and human. Every morning he'd see folding chairs left out, confetti tangled in the ropes, and once a banner tied between the pilings that read, "Havens Reach Community Dock." Each time he peeled one of those signs down, it reappeared the next day like a stubborn weed. At first he tried to reason with her. He told himself it was a misunderstanding, that once she realized the dock was his private property, she'd correct it. So one afternoon, he walked over to where she was arranging decorations for a spring unity brunch. She was directing people like an event planner, wearing her bright coral blazer, clipboard in hand. When she noticed him, her expression didn't change. It was the same practiced smile she used when she wanted to appear diplomatic. He explained calmly that the dock was privately owned, deeded separately from the HOA's jurisdiction, and not available for events. Karen didn't even look up from her list. "Mr. Mercer," she said with theatrical patience, "the board has amended the covenants. You might want to review the updated bylaws before making such claims." She said it like she was correcting a child, and it took everything in him to stay composed. "And who voted on that amendment?" he asked quietly. That's when she looked up, her smile hardening just enough to reveal the truth. "The board," she replied. "We follow democratic process here." But the board turned out to be Karen and two of her closest friends, neither of whom even lived on the waterfront. The meeting minutes listed a quorum reached on a Sunday, and the signatures were suspiciously identical, the handwriting looping with the same deliberate pressure. It wasn't democracy. It was theater, and like most bad performances, it relied on the audience not looking too closely. What unsettled David most wasn't the audacity. It was the ease, the way people accepted her authority without question, the way the HOA newsletter praised her for bringing unity to the community, while she stripped people of ownership one dock at a time. It reminded him of how erosion worked, not sudden but steady. You don't notice it happening until the ground beneath you starts to give way. A week later, Karen escalated again. She hired a self-appointed security volunteer, a local man named Brad, who fancied himself a law enforcer. Brad began patrolling the docks with a clipboard and reflective vest, stopping anyone who didn't have a visible HOA badge. The first time David encountered him, he was told he couldn't access community property without prior approval. The irony hit so hard, it almost felt funny. Almost. David stood there, listening to this man who couldn't possibly understand the structure he was standing on, tell him that he needed permission to use what he'd built. It was like being told by a stranger that he was trespassing in his own memories. He didn't argue. He just turned and walked home. But the silence that followed him back up the path wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, like something sacred had been trespassed. The final blow came one warm Saturday morning when his daughter, Emily, and his young grandson, Noah, came to visit. It was supposed to be simple. A day of fishing and stories, the kind of ordinary joy that keeps a family connected across generations. Noah was 6, endlessly curious, the kind of kid who thought every ripple on the water had a secret to tell. He ran ahead with his little fishing rod, calling out, "Grandpa, I'll catch the first one." But when he reached the dock gate, Brad stepped in front of him. "Sorry, kiddo. HOA property. Members only," he said, his voice flat. David approached, confused but calm. "It's all right," he said. "This is my dock. We're just here to fish." Brad didn't budge. "Ma'am's orders," he replied, jerking his head toward Karen, who was setting up folding tables at the far end of the dock for another one of her gatherings. She said no exceptions, not even for guests. For a moment, everything around David blurred. The laughter from the dock, the sun glinting off the water, the faint smell of sunscreen and wine. He saw Noah's face fall, the confusion turning into embarrassment. Emily stepped in, whispering, "Dad, it's not worth it." But the damage was already done. Humiliation burns differently when it's witnessed by someone you love. He took his grandson's hand and turned away. But as they walked back toward the house, Noah asked the question that lodged itself deep in David's chest. "Grandpa, why did they say it's not yours?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. Because, in that moment, he realized this wasn't just about a dock, or even about power. It was about legacy, about what you allow people to take from you when you stay silent too long. That's when something inside him shifted. The patience that once felt like wisdom now felt like surrender, and surrender was no longer acceptable. That night, as the moon reflected off the water, David sat at his desk with the old property binders spread open. The sound of laughter still drifted faintly across the bay, the echoes of Karen's party carried by the wind. He flipped through blueprints, contracts, and deeds until he found what he was looking for: the original development documents he'd helped file years ago. The dock was explicitly listed under private ownership. There were signatures, notarized filings, and county seals that left no room for interpretation. The marina wasn't just his emotionally, it was his legally. He leaned back in his chair, feeling a quiet resolve take root where frustration had lived. People like Karen thrived on reaction. They wanted chaos, outrage, noise. But power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it watches. Sometimes it builds silently, like the tide gathering strength just beyond the horizon. As he closed the folder, a small, knowing smile touched his face. She thought she'd humiliated him, cornered him with her paperwork and titles, but she didn't realize who she was dealing with, or what kind of man he used to be. David Mercer wasn't just a retired homeowner defending a dock. He was the man who had mapped this shoreline before anyone called it home. And soon, Karen would learn that the tides she'd tried to control were already turning. David had always kept records, not because he was obsessive, but because he understood the power of paper. Over the years, he'd learned that in disputes, emotion might win sympathy, but documentation wins battles. That night, as the wind pressed softly against the windows, he pulled a heavy metal box from the closet. It was scratched and dull from decades of use, its lock stiff from salt air. Inside, layered in manila folders and old blueprints, were fragments of his past life: the engineer, the planner, the builder. He hadn't looked at these documents in years, not since Caroline was alive. Back then, they represented ambition. Now, they represented something quieter, but no less powerful: truth. He spread the contents across his desk under the warm lamplight. Each page smelled faintly of time, ink, dust, and the ghosts of signatures. At first glance, the blueprints were technical, cold, a maze of measurements and notations. But to David, they told a story. The marina layout, the channel dredging permits, the land parcel divisions, all of it had his fingerprints on it. The handwriting in the margins was his. His initials appeared beside engineering revisions, his signature next to county approvals. It wasn't nostalgia that gripped him, it was recognition. He hadn't just lived here, he had built here. As he traced the lines of the map, something clicked into place. The property's foundation, the very land the HOA sat on, had been transferred years ago into a land trust. And the trust, he realized with a quiet shock, still listed him as the majority shareholder. He'd set it up that way back when the development company dissolved, keeping his stake as a safety measure. He had forgotten about it, assuming time had eroded its relevance. But time hadn't touched the law, and the law still recognized his authority. The HOA didn't own the ground they were standing on, they leased it, which meant that Karen, with all her self-righteous memos and proclamations, had been threatening the man who legally owned the land beneath her feet. The realization didn't come with fireworks or triumphant music. It came with calm, like the sea right before a shift in tide. He leaned back, staring at the deed. All those nights when he'd bitten his tongue, choosing patience over confrontation, suddenly made sense. Silence, he realized, had preserved more than his peace. It had preserved his power. People like Karen mistake quiet for weakness, but quiet is often where strength hides, gathering, waiting, calculating. He spent the next hour reading through the lease agreements, cross-referencing them with county records he'd stored digitally years before. The language was precise, almost poetic in its restraint. The HOA was defined not as an owner, but as a tenant, its governing body operating under a long-term lease contingent on good faith management and compliance. One clause, highlighted in faint yellow from decades ago, stood out like a flare in the dark: breach of contractual integrity. Misrepresentation of ownership or unauthorized claim of property rights shall constitute immediate forfeiture of lease authority. For the first time in months, David smiled, not out of arrogance, but out of certainty. He wasn't going to shout, protest, or demand. He was going to prove. The next morning, he called an old friend, Arthur Lane, a real estate attorney he'd worked with back in his development days. Arthur's voice was gravelly and familiar, the kind of voice that carried both humor and caution. When David explained the situation, there was a long pause on the line before Arthur chuckled. "You're telling me this woman's been using your dock for yoga and thinks you need her permission to breathe near it?" David's laugh was quiet but genuine. "That's about the shape of it." They met the next afternoon at Arthur's downtown office. The place smelled like polished wood and old victories. Arthur combed through the documents with the practiced precision of a surgeon. Every few minutes he muttered things like, "Unbelievable," and "You've got them by the anchors." When he finished, he leaned back and tapped the papers. "It's airtight, David. You never transferred controlling interest. The HOA's operating on your land. Legally speaking, she's been bossing around her landlord. We can terminate their leasehold tomorrow." The words settled over him like sunlight after a long storm. But David wasn't impulsive. He knew power handled carelessly could corrupt just as easily as authority abused. "We're not going to bulldoze them," he said softly. "Not yet. I want this clean, legal, quiet." Arthur nodded. "You want strategy, not spectacle." "Exactly. Because this wasn't revenge. It was correction." Karen had made the mistake of believing that loudness equaled control. But true control doesn't announce itself. It just shifts the ground under your opponent until they're standing on nothing. As they finalized the verification process, David found himself thinking about Caroline again. She had always said he was at his best when he was building something meaningful. Maybe this, strange as it was a form of rebuilding. Not marinas, but boundaries. Protecting what mattered. Not for pride, but for peace. On the drive home, the water glimmered beside the road like liquid silver. He passed the marina and saw Karen striding along the pier, clipboard in hand, giving orders to a maintenance worker repainting the fence she'd claimed as her own. He didn't stop. He didn't wave. For the first time, he felt no anger, just a deep sense of inevitability. She had no idea the ground beneath her was already shifting, that her empire of paperwork was built on a lease about to expire. That night, David sat again by the window, the same spot where he'd once felt powerless, and allowed himself to breathe differently. It wasn't defiance. It was clarity. Knowledge changes posture. It steadies you. You stop reacting and start directing. You see patterns where others see chaos. He wasn't just the man defending his dock anymore. He was the man holding the deed. The ocean outside whispered softly against the pilings, rhythmic and patient, like it understood the lesson too. Power, real power, doesn't need to shout. It just waits for the tide to turn. And for the first time, David was no longer waiting for peace to return to him. He was preparing to claim it. When David decided to act, it wasn't out of anger anymore. It was precision. The kind of calm that comes when you stop reacting and start engineering outcomes. The discovery of the trust ownership had given him leverage, but leverage was only useful if applied correctly. And David had spent a lifetime designing systems that held under pressure. He wasn't about to abandon that discipline now, so he began, not with confrontation, but with structure. Every good engineer knows, before you move anything, you secure the foundation. He spent 3 quiet mornings reviewing everything: the HOA's financial records, their renovation budgets, and their outstanding debts. It wasn't hard to find what he was looking for. Karen's so-called beautification projects, the ornamental fencing, the branded flags, the new security kiosks, had all been financed through one bloated loan with Coastal First Bank. A loan that had become an eyesore in itself. Late payments, overdrawn reserves and penalties stacking like barnacles. It was mismanagement disguised as vision. The numbers told the truth Karen never could. And what David saw wasn't just opportunity, it was inevitability. That afternoon, he called Arthur again. "I need a name," David said. "Something neutral, quiet, something that won't attract attention." Arthur paused for a second, then smiled through the phone. "You're planning to buy them, aren't you?" David didn't confirm, but the silence said enough. They chose the name Bayfront Holdings, LLC, unassuming, professional, invisible. A name that could pass through paperwork like a shadow. The plan unfolded with deliberate simplicity. Arthur contacted the bank posing as the representative of an investment group interested in acquiring distressed property loans within the region. Coastal First had no reason to hesitate. The HOA's loan was a headache they'd been trying to offload for months. Within days, the paperwork moved from negotiation to execution. And just like that, without a single public word or meeting, David Mercer's shell company became the new holder of the HOA's debt. The signatures were clean, the filings legal, the transaction swift. The irony was beautiful in its symmetry. The HOA, which had once prided itself on controlling him, was now financially tethered to him. David didn't celebrate. There was no victory lap, no dramatic toast to revenge. What he felt was something subtler, heavier, the satisfaction of alignment. The system that had been manipulated to bully him was now bending toward equilibrium. That's what justice looks like when done right. It doesn't shout, it balances. But still, there was the matter of timing. He knew better than to act immediately. Let Karen believe her authority was untouched. Let her host her meetings, send her newsletters, and parade around in that coral blazer like the queen of a sinking ship. Every move she made from here on would only tighten the noose she'd unknowingly woven herself. The true art of strategy isn't destruction, it's patience. Because the longer a lie runs unchecked, the deeper it digs its own grave. The weeks that followed were almost surreal. Karen continued to expand her influence, announcing new HOA initiatives with confidence. She proposed repainting the marina benches, launching a summer community gala, and increasing member dues to cover inflationary maintenance. No one questioned her because everyone assumed she knew what she was doing. Authority is a costume, and she wore it well. But authority without ownership is like a flag in the wind, loud but powerless. David would see her from his porch sometimes, clipboard in hand, giving orders with that same rehearsed certainty. And though she didn't know it, each order was being issued on land whose rights had already been revoked, on property governed by a lease that was no longer valid. The HOA's leadership existed only on paper. And now, even that paper belonged to him. The elegance of it made him think of Caroline. She used to tell him that grace isn't in how you fight. It's in how you win quietly. When the moment was right, Arthur drafted the termination notice. It was a concise document, just a few pages, citing specific violations of lease terms, unauthorized commercial activity, misuse of private property, breach of fiduciary responsibility, and failure to maintain compliance with financial reporting. Every line referenced evidence, timestamps, and clauses Karen had probably never read. The legal precision was surgical. This wasn't a loud act of revenge. It was the quiet closing of a circuit. The filing went to the county clerk's office the following Monday. It was done without fanfare, just a digital submission time-stamped at 9:12 a.m. By the time Karen finished her morning coffee and sent out her weekly HOA bulletin, the organization she presided over no longer existed in any enforceable legal form. It had no leasehold, no authority, no standing. What remained was an illusion, a structure propped up by people who hadn't yet realized their leader's throne had turned to dust. David didn't gloat. That kind of triumph was beneath the gravity of the moment. What he felt was clarity. For months, he had endured indignity, intrusion, and the quiet theft of peace. Now, he understood something vital about power. It doesn't need recognition to be real. True power doesn't need to be announced. It only needs to be exercised wisely. And yet, the most striking part of this transformation wasn't what he'd done. It was what he hadn't done. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't retaliated in kind. He had stayed calm, analytical, and strategic. And in doing so, he demonstrated something most people never learn. Revenge is temporary, but correction is permanent. The next few days passed quietly, though the tension in the community began to shift. Residents noticed inconsistencies in HOA communications, payments bouncing, invoices unprocessed, contractors confused about who to report to. The system Karen had built was unraveling thread by thread, not because anyone tore it apart, but because it had lost the structure holding it together. David's silence had become gravity, pulling the illusion of her authority down to sea level. At night, sitting by the water, he thought about how strange it was that justice could feel so still. There was no applause, no witnesses, just the soft lap of waves against the pilings and the faint reflection of the moon on the dock, the same dock that started it all. Sometimes the best victories aren't loud enough for others to notice, but you feel them in your bones. They change the way you breathe. They make you stand taller, even if no one's watching. Karen still didn't know. She still sent her emails, still strutted through the neighborhood like the architect of order. But every command she gave now was weightless, every directive empty. She was a queen ruling over an empire that no longer existed. And David, calm, deliberate, invisible, was the one who had rewritten the rules beneath her feet. He didn't need to tell her yet. He wanted her to walk in her illusion a little longer. Because some lessons aren't taught with words. Some are learned only when the foundation you trusted vanishes beneath you. And you realize too late that the silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. The meeting began like every other one of Karen's carefully staged performances. She stood at the front of the room beneath the flickering fluorescent lights, holding her clipboard like a scepter, her voice sharp enough to cut through the low hum of uneasy conversation. The chairs were filled. Neighbors who had once smiled politely at her now sat with arms crossed, unsure of what they were about to witness. Karen, however, had no doubt. She was on another crusade, and today's enemy was illegal interference. Her words were practiced, theatrical. She spoke of a mysterious force trying to undermine the integrity of the HOA, of outsiders tampering with governance, and of slanderous rumors meant to destabilize her leadership. Each phrase dripped with self-importance. David sat near the back, calm, almost detached. He watched her talk, her gestures sharp and exaggerated, the way someone clings to control when they feel it slipping. There was something almost sad about it, the desperation of a person who had mistaken power for purpose. For months, she'd been the loudest voice in every room, and now her volume felt like a last defense against silence. When she turned her glare toward him, he met it with quiet steadiness. The contrast was stark. One person frantic to be believed, the other anchored in truth that didn't need to announce itself. Karen slammed her papers on the table and demanded that whoever is responsible for this interference come forward. The room stirred, heads turning toward David. He rose slowly, not in defiance, but in deliberate calm. The scrape of his chair against the floor was the only sound. "That would be me," he said simply. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Karen blinked, taken aback for the briefest second before recovering her practiced poise. "Mr. Mercer," she said, forcing a smile, "perhaps you'd like to explain why you've been circulating false documents about this community's ownership. We take legal threats very seriously here." David nodded. "So do I." He walked to the front with a small stack of folders tucked under his arm, each document marked and neatly clipped. He didn't raise his voice or embellish. He just began. These aren't rumors, Karen. They're records, and every one of them is public. He opened the first folder, a copy of the cashier's check and transfer papers showing Bayfront Holdings, LLC, as the new holder of the HOA's master loan. "You're in debt," he said softly, "but not to Coastal First Bank anymore. You're in debt to me." The silence that followed was electric. People shifted forward, squinting at the papers as he laid them on the table. Karen tried to interrupt, but he raised a hand slightly, not to silence her, but to hold the space steady. "The second document," he continued, "is the termination of leasehold agreement, filed with the county clerk's office 3 weeks ago. It outlines multiple breaches of contract, unauthorized commercial use of private property, misuse of funds, and violation of original covenants. The HOA's lease to operate this property is no longer valid." You could feel the air change. A kind of collective realization moved through the room, the slow, dawning awareness that everything Karen had claimed authority over no longer existed. She laughed, a brittle, nervous sound that didn't reach her eyes. "You can't just terminate an HOA. That's absurd." But the laughter died when David opened the third folder. He laid out the original deed, dated and notarized, with his signature alongside the county's. "This is the marina's deed, the same one I filed when I helped design this place 20 years ago. I never transferred ownership. That means your community property is built on my private land. Every event, every party, every so-called improvement you've authorized was done without permission." For a heartbeat, the room was completely still. Then came the sound, a sharp, collective gasp that felt almost physical. You could see people's faces shift, confusion melting into disbelief, disbelief hardening into understanding. Karen's eyes darted from the papers to the crowd, searching for support that wasn't there anymore. Her confidence cracked. "He's lying," she stammered. This is forged." But no one echoed her. Someone in the back whispered, "Check the seal." Another voice added quietly, "That's a county stamp." It wasn't anger that broke her. It was isolation. Power without believers is just noise. She tried to grab the papers, but David slid them out of reach. "These documents have already been verified," he said evenly. "And if you need further confirmation, the county clerk's office has the originals. The same office that processed your violation filings." Karen's voice rose into a shrill pitch. "You can't do this. I am this HOA. You hear me? I am this community." Her words bounced off the walls, but no one answered. People she'd once intimidated now sat watching her unravel, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock and relief. A few even looked at David with quiet gratitude, the kind reserved for someone who does what everyone else is too afraid to attempt. When she began shouting, a uniformed officer who had been standing discreetly near the exit stepped forward. David had requested a quiet presence beforehand, anticipating that reason alone might not be enough. The officer approached calmly, speaking in a low tone. Karen jerked away, flinging her arms as papers scattered to the floor. "This is harassment! You'll all regret this!" But the struggle was short. The authority she had abused for so long no longer recognized her. When the door closed behind her, the room exhaled as if it had been holding its breath for months. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, an older neighbor stood up, voice steady but trembling. "Thank you, David," he said. "We didn't know." Others nodded, the tension unraveling into murmurs of apology, of disbelief, of quiet admiration. It wasn't celebration, it was release. The kind that follows after a long storm finally breaks. David gathered the documents, stacking them neatly, his movements precise. He didn't gloat, didn't bask in victory. He simply looked at the people around him, the same neighbors who had once turned away, and said, "You were never the problem. You just needed the truth." And in that moment, they saw him not as the quiet man at the edge of the marina, but as the foundation that had been there all along. The meeting adjourned quietly. People lingered, talking in low voices, the weight of realization softening into something almost like hope. Outside, the evening air smelled of salt and rain. The marina lights flickered on, casting ripples of gold across the water. For the first time in a long time, the dock felt still again, its peace restored not by force, but by truth, finally surfacing. In the weeks that followed the meeting, something remarkable happened, not through policy or punishment, but through quiet choice. The HOA, once so loud and controlling, simply fell apart. Its authority had been built on fear and confusion, and when those disappeared, so did its power. The management company withdrew its contract, citing irreconcilable governance issues, and the once feared bylaws became nothing more than paper relics. For the first time in years, the residents of Havens Reach found themselves ungoverned and unsure of what to do next. At first, there was hesitation. People were used to being told what to do, where to park, what color to paint their fences, even how long they could leave a light on by the dock. Freedom, oddly enough, made them nervous. It's strange how dependence can disguise itself as order. But David understood that rebuilding community wasn't about rules, it was about trust. He didn't want to be anyone's savior or leader. He'd seen what power did when it lost humility. So instead, he called a meeting. Not in a hall, not behind a podium, but right on the dock. It was a small group at first. Mike, the retired electrician. Bill, the Marine veteran who'd been fined for flying his flag. A few younger families who'd avoided conflict but now wanted change. David spoke plainly. "We don't need another HOA," he said. "We need each other." His voice wasn't commanding, just steady. "Let's build something simpler. No hierarchy, no bureaucracy. A co-op, where everyone owns their piece and no one controls it." At first, there was silence. Then someone asked, "Who decides what gets done?" David smiled. "Whoever's willing to show up." It was that simple, and that radical. Over time, more neighbors joined. They started by fixing what was broken, repainting the benches, repairing the dock lights, trimming the hedges that had gone wild under months of chaos. Work that once felt like obligation now felt like ownership. And in the small, unglamorous act of working side by side, they rediscovered what community was supposed to mean. Even those who had once followed Karen's orders began to soften. A woman who used to enforce parking citations showed up one morning with homemade muffins and an apology. Another neighbor offered to handle bookkeeping for shared expenses, just until things evened out. Trust, David realized, doesn't come back with announcements. It seeps in quietly, the way sunlight warms cold wood. The marina changed too. Where it had once been patrolled and policed, it now breathed again. Families returned for evening walks. Children chased each other along the railings, and laughter replaced the brittle silence that had haunted the water. David often stood by, tools in hand, not directing but helping. When people thanked him, he'd just shake his head. "You fixed this," he'd say. "All I did was remind you it was yours." And in that new rhythm of ordinary kindness, something deeper healed. The invisible wounds of fear and resentment that authority had left behind. The dock, once a battleground, became a gathering place again. People fished there, read there, shared coffee at sunrise. The rules that mattered now weren't written. They were lived. Respect, gratitude, and accountability. Values stronger than any covenant. One morning, long after the legal dust had settled, David took his grandson Noah out to the dock. The sky was still pale, streaked with that fragile pink light that only exists between night and morning. The world felt suspended, quiet, safe, complete. Noah sat beside him, legs dangling over the edge, holding his small fishing rod with both hands. "Grandpa," he asked softly, "is it really over?" David smiled, watching the ripples in the water. "It's never really over," he said. "But sometimes the storm runs out of wind." He reached into his pocket and ran his thumb over a small brass plaque he'd had made the week before. Later that morning, with Mike's help, he fixed it to the first piling of the dock. The engraving was simple, just 10 words. For Caroline, who loved calm seas. He stood there for a moment after, hand resting on the wood, feeling the morning breeze off the bay. It wasn't triumph, he felt. It was peace, the kind that arrives only after something hard and necessary has ended. Behind him, the community stirred awake. Someone laughed from a balcony. Another called good morning from the path. The world had gone on, and that was the quiet beauty of it. Nothing grand, nothing loud, just life finding its rhythm again. The same dock that had once symbolized conflict now carried the weight of memory and the promise of renewal. As the sun climbed higher, David cast his line into the still water beside his grandson. The sea shimmered, endless and forgiving. He realized then that legacy wasn't about control or ownership. It was about preservation, about leaving something steady behind for those who came after you. The dock didn't belong to him anymore, not in the way it once did. It belonged to everyone who had learned from it, the ones who had fought, forgiven, rebuilt. And as the first fish tugged gently on the line, David smiled to himself. The water was calm again. The storm had passed, and what remained was stronger than before.